Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Josh Houry, and I am the Community Relations Coordinator here at the Saskatchewan SPCA. This webinar was organized by our One Health Education Committee, and the One Health Education Committee was established to help improve the quality of life for animals and people by providing education for animal welfare and human service professionals. This is the fourth webinar in our series of 4 webinars, so the final one. Thank you for joining us today. The webinars here this week and last that we've been going through explore the complex relationship between all forms of violence. This includes the abuse of children and older adults, domestic violence, and of course animal abuse. Today's presentation is titled, What Really Goes into Animal Protection Work? This session will focus on demystifying the investigative process that goes into animal protection work. Participants will leave the session able to identify what constitutes distress in animals according to the legislation. You will have a clear understanding of the process that occurs when an animal welfare concern is reported and how it is investigated. As always, we encourage you to share your questions and bring them forward using the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse down along the bottom, you will see a Q&A button. If you click on that, it will bring up the Q&A window. Feel free to enter your question in there, and Dawn will answer the questions as they come in throughout the presentation. Plus, we will have an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. For those that have a microphone and might be interested in asking your question verbally, we ask that you use the raise hand feature. Again, there's a button in the bottom toolbar, in the same toolbar with the Q&A button. If you click on that raise hand button, that will notify me that you'd like to raise a question, and then we can enable you access to speak with Dawn directly. With that being said, I would like to introduce today's speaker, and today's presenter is Dawn Ferguson. Dawn is the Executive Director of Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan. It is the animal protection agency responsible for enforcing the Animal Protection Act here in the province, except for in the cities of Regina and Saskatoon. Prior to this, Dawn has investigated over 4,000 files of animal cruelty and neglect with the Alberta SPCA and the Calgary Humane Society as a peace officer under the Animal Protection Act of Alberta. He has also instructed at the Justice and Solicitor General Staff College, providing instruction for the Alberta Peace Officer Investigator Program. Dawn is a registered veterinary technologist with the Saskatchewan Veterinary Medical Association, and he completed his diploma in 2005 from Lakeland College in Vermilion. Prior to his law enforcement career, Dawn served 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces with the Canadian Airborne Regiment and the 1st Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. It's my pleasure to welcome Dawn. Dawn, the floor is all yours.
Sorry, Josh, I was just trying to figure out how to get my slideshow started. So appreciate that now that I've got the slide sharing figured out. Welcome, everybody. I hope the title wasn't misleading and discouraging people from participating, because really all the things that Josh had mentioned, I want to speak about today. But I really want to build on what the other speakers had talked about with the child abuse and neglect, the older adult abuse and neglect, and domestic violence, and tie in the animal piece to it. Many of them touched on it briefly, that there is a correlation between those types of abuse and animal abuse. And I'm hopefully going to provide how animal abuse fits into that link as well today, with providing some information as to how we go about doing that. So the link is not something new. For historical context, St. Francis of Assisi back in the 1100s was made or had said that if you have men who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you'll have men who will deal likewise with their fellow man. And then John Locke, who was an English philosopher and physician, and is widely regarded as one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers, spoke about children and how children interact with animals. And if they were interacting with animals in an appropriate manner, that they would do that later in their lives. So the link is nothing new. Unfortunately, still within the law enforcement community, the link isn't readily understood, or it's not always actioned on. And we see a lot of, well, it's just an animal call, when in fact, it's never just an animal call. There's usually an owner or caretaker that's responsible for that animal that has some problems of their own. Having said that, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about what Animal Protection Services is. The Animal Protection Act, which is the legislation here in the province, our investigative process, what is and isn't animal cruelty, covers some overlapping animal and human welfare issues, and then when and how to report if you suspect any animal welfare concerns. One of the things that was on my main slide that you may not have noticed, some of the content and photographs may be disturbing, so just be aware of that. If you need to avert your eyes, most certainly do so. But that's the reality of what we deal with and our animal protection officers deal with. So Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan, we're a non-profit in 2015. We have 7 full-time animal protection officers for the province, including also an operations assistant and myself as ED. We have a volunteer board of directors, and we were created to take up the enforcement work that the Saskatchewan SPCA had done for the past 40 years. Our areas, and I believe Josh had mentioned that in his intro, we do livestock complaints across the entire province, and then companion animal complaints in both rural and municipal areas of Saskatchewan where there are not other agencies that have APOs. So the Regina Humane Society and the Saskatoon SPCA are animal protection agencies and employ APOs. So they do enforcement and investigations with regard to the Animal Protection Act in those areas. Being a new agency and an enforcement agency solely, we do not do any education or fundraising or have a shelter. We're still confused with an animal rights organization or animal control or a rescue group. In fact, what we are is strictly an enforcement agency. So Animal Protection Services has a contract with the Ministry of Agriculture, and that's to enforce the Animal Protection Act in urban and rural Saskatchewan. As I said, the Saskatoon SPCA and the Regina Humane Society do enforcement within their city limits, but they don't do livestock complaints. Their officers haven't been provided with the training to deal with livestock specific complaints. So if there's any, and I use 2 examples, Ezra's Place has wildlife and livestock, which we investigate, and the forestry farm in Saskatoon is another area, although within Saskatoon is where we've been. The other thing about the Animal Protection Act is RCMP and other municipal police officers are animal protection officers, and they do have the authority under the Animal Protection Act to do that type of enforcement. Unfortunately, many times they just don't have the expertise, nor do they have the facilities or animal handling skills to deal with some of these situations. So the Animal Protection Act 2018, it came into force at September 17th of 2018. It replaced the old act. There's also sections, of course, within the criminal code for animal cruelty, but this is the one that we primarily deal with. And the penalties for the maximum penalty for the Animal Protection Act are fines up to $25,000 and or up to 2 years of jail time. At this point, with it still being a new act, we've still not received a sentence of jail time as of yet, but we can get a prohibition from owning animals for a specific period of time, and we have already received a sentence of a lifetime prohibition from owning animals. And in order to provide a current address and allow for inspection without a warrant to ensure compliance. And so that allows us to, once they've been convicted and an order made, that we can attend to their residence, including their private dwelling, to ensure that they don't have animals in their possession. The provision that someone would be offending against is Section 4 in the Animal Protection Act, meaning no person shall cause an animal to be in distress, or no person responsible for an animal shall cause or permit that animal to be in distress. You'll see in the next slide, all the instances that we commonly think of as being animal abuse are covered within the definition of what is distress. The definition of distress in the Act is what you see in front of us. For those from Alberta, you'll see that it's very similar to what is there. I think there may have been some copy and pasting going on just because it's an excellent definition within law enforcement. Also within the Act are sections 3 to 6 of the Animal Protection Act, and these are the animal care duties, the transportation, and refers to the euthanasia of animals. And as I said, this definition of distress, if you've been reading it as I've been speaking, covers those things that we commonly think of abuse. So making sure that they have sufficient food and water, that they have adequate veterinary care or medical attention, that they're protected from injurious heat and cold, pain, suffering, abused or neglected, or being kept in unsanitary conditions, which are further described in Section 3 of the animal care duties that include ventilation, light, space, all of those things, or if they're abandoned by its owner or the person responsible, which would likely cause it to be in distress. As with most regulatory offenses, there are exemptions, and these exemptions, an animal is not to be considered in distress if it's handled in a manner that's consistent with a standard code of practice, or practice or procedure that is prescribed as acceptable, or in accordance with generally accepted practices of animal management. And you can see from the photos that I've placed on the left-hand side, typically ones that, you know, I know Alberta, their Alberta Veterinary Medical Association has, I don't know if the word banned is appropriate for what's in the bylaws, but ear cropping and tail docking has been removed, so wouldn't be considered a common practice. So if someone was to tail dock or crop the ears now in Alberta, they could be charged under their legislation. But generally, the accepted practices are things for exemptions for livestock. And you see the example of ear tagging and then freeze branding or branding there, where we know that this is painful. However, to identify and track animals, it's considered an accepted practice. And although under the definition distress, that's likely to cause pain and may be considered abuse, because it is an industry standard practice, and within the code of practice, it's not distress, and therefore the individual would not be charged. So what is animal abuse or cruelty? People have always asked, well, how much is too much, or what's not enough? Where on that scale along the bottom? Does it have to be absolutely perfect conditions? Do all dogs have to be sitting in, living on the sofa eating small pieces of steak? Or is it okay for them to be outside? Can we use a deck for shelter? Does it have to have a heated, insulated doghouse? So these definitions are great, but all of them boils down to if it's a violation of the Animal Protection Act. And it's usually a combination of things and not one single thing that we look at as animal abuse or cruelty. So let's look at some of those instances or specific ideas of what people typically think of as abuse or cruelty, which we now know for legal purposes and within the legislation is defined as distress. So physical abuse. Physical beating, it's hard to prove without video or photo evidence and good solid witness statements. Sometimes there's very little evidence of physical harm because of the hair code on both dogs and cats, most companion animals. It's very hard to see any bruising or injury. And unfortunately, a lot of the time you don't see it until after the animal is deceased and then a necropsy is performed. You can still prosecute even if there isn't any physical damage seen if you can prove that it's causing unnecessary pain. We had an instance where a case where a person was disciplining their dog using one of those sort of bamboo garden that's used for propping up plants. Although a thin bamboo rod with the flex and everything in it and striking the animal with it, it certainly caused unnecessary pain, and the person was indeed convicted of an offense. Corrections, are they physical abuse? They're still acceptable when training your animal, but the line between abuse and training is still very gray. There's really a movement in the dog training community, I know, to use less and less invasive or corrective methods to do it. And views in this are always changing and rapidly. One of the things between sort of a guideline that we use is if you wouldn't discipline your toddler in that manner, then certainly you shouldn't be disciplining your animal in that manner either. The idea of, a closed fist or kicking, striking, even with an open hand in the head area, are not acceptable methods of correction. So recognizing abuse, this can be difficult. Obviously, if you're witnessing any violence towards animals, punching, kicking, throwing, choking, excessive uses of shock or pinch collars certainly would be abuse and causing the animal distress. If there's evidence of multiple or repeated injuries in the animal, the history, particularly for those working in the veterinary community, if the history or explanation for injuries seems unlikely or it doesn't match the injuries, or when the caregiver, when asked about it, are evasive about the cause of the injuries, certainly it would be would warrant investigation by an animal protection officer. You would have a reasonable concern that someone was abusing this animal. And then this one is, I always am cautious with this one, extremely submissive or fearful animals. I have a Rottweiler. He's afraid of the world. I have to be careful with my tone of voice, and he will shirk and cower away from me. I've certainly never struck him. He's never been struck by anyone in our family, but he is just very sensitive. But he's like that with everyone. We had another incident where an officer attended a residence and the animal was fearful, but it was only doing it with one person. Now that is suspicious and certainly would warrant further investigation. Why is this animal just fearful and submissive and afraid of only one person in particular? So neglect, suffering, lack of care, yes, that's distress. And as I said before, it doesn't really matter how we define it to some extent. These things are all lumped into lack of adequate care in the distress section. And as I said, there is usually more than one issue. So lack of appropriate food and water, inappropriate shelter, and then just overall neglect of the regular expected care of the animal. And then, of course, suffering or lack of care for any injuries or illness. So let's have a look at some of those things that we regularly encounter, and then so you have an idea of what I'm talking about with regard to abuse, and then we'll speak about how it relates to the link. So food quantity. Food must be in a quantity and quality to maintain the animal in a state of good health. Certainly visually, anyone looking at these two photos, even if they're not familiar with livestock, can see that the transverse process of the spine is visible. The ribs are clearly visible for the cow, the hooks and pins around the hip area, clearly visible. These animals have either not been fed a sufficient quantity or quality of food for a period of time that they've begun to decrease and show a poor body condition. Again, the quality of feed, these horses with the feed that they're getting, you can see that some of them seem to be faring okay, and others clearly aren't. So whether that's a quality or quantity issue requires further investigation. And maybe what needs to happen is with the competition for feed, maybe we need to split these into smaller groups and provide access to more feed at that time. Water, certainly absolutely necessary, and it needs to be provided in a sufficient amount to maintain the animal in a state of good health. Again, for companion animals, we prefer them to have water at all times, but the Act does say sufficient to maintain them in a state of good health. So if they don't, as long as they're not showing signs of dehydration, but clearly you can see that these horses milling around these empty water troughs are looking for some water, and clearly there's none there. We look at the condition of this water here. That's dirty, that's disgusting, clearly hasn't been changed for a while. The container that it's even in is showing rust. So fresh potable water, again, for normal hydration health, and especially in poultry and livestock production animals, we want to make sure that the water is tested at least annually from a municipal water source to ensure it's suitable. And then if it's not, obviously corrective action has to be taken. Water should be monitored on an ongoing basis for any changes, whether that's odor, rust, cloudiness, anything that would indicate that there's a change in quality, and then making sure that they're getting the good quality water that they should. Shelter. These chickens are being housed on a trailer completely open to the elements. There is absolutely zero shelter protection from injurious heat or cold, depending on what weather we would be encountering here in Saskatchewan. Completely unacceptable for what would be expected for poultry or at this time. So shelter is species specific. If we look at this one, it's got to provide adequate shelter and reasonable protection from injurious heat. Now, I can tell you, because you can't really tell from this photo, that is just simply a plywood box with a little bit of straw in it. It's not really insulated, and that dog is a greyhound cross with a thin hair coat. Certainly that shelter was not adequate, particularly for the cold. So having an insulated shelter with appropriate insulation and bedding so that this dog can get out and be protected from injurious heat or cold. Shelter doesn't just mean for outside. Shelter can be inside because it's not to impair the animal's health and well-being by confining them to an enclosed area with inadequate space, excuse me, unsanitary conditions, or without providing an opportunity for exercise. A few of these kennels are too small for the dogs in them. They should be able to stand up, turn around, and lay down in a natural position. Some of them, you can tell, that are in that really dark basement are extremely unsanitary and filthy conditions and haven't been cleaned for some time. So unsanitary conditions, Tufts Animal Care and Condition Scale is one that we use and the courts have accepted. And so in this condition here, it would be described as a 4 on the scale, which is very unsanitary. So there's many days accumulation of feces and or urine. It's difficult for the animal to avoid contact with waste material. In fact, I don't think you could step on any part of this floor without encountering waste material, not just feces, but just garbage and waste material. There is a moderate amount of trash and garbage or clutter that's present, and it's going to inhibit any comfortable rest or movement by the animal. And of course, you can't really use all your senses in this, but the there was a significant odor that made breathing in that environment unpleasant. So if it's unpleasant for humans, it's certainly going to be unpleasant for animals who have a much keener sense of smell than we do. Also, with shelter, any standing water or mud that's difficult to avoid are also considered very unsanitary according to the Tufts Animal Carrying Condition Scale. And the way that these dogs were being kept would be considered very unsanitary as well. Other things that we encounter, lack of hoof care. Clearly from both photographs, this hasn't just occurred. This has happened over an extended period of time, which has now affected these animals' natural gait and needed to be addressed long before we became involved. Untreated injuries. So owners need to provide adequate veterinary care or medical attention where an animal is wounded or ill. And that can be companion animals or, again, in the case of livestock. Some other things, grooming neglect. This dog, it's difficult to see from this picture, but the two rear legs had actually become matted together so that this animal was basically a tripod. The urine scalding and everything once this animal was shaved was so bad, plus the other health conditions from this animal being neglected. Unfortunately, the outcome for this poor animal was euthanasia. And then another is dental disease. I wish that everybody on the call today had never experienced dental pain, but there's probably a significant amount of us that have had some teeth issues, and we know how painful they are. Certainly this mouth and this dog, you can see by the inflamed gums, and in certain areas, this was painful, or is in some areas still very painful, making it difficult for this animal to eat. So for our investigative process, if we look from the left moving towards the right of the screen and Inspector Clouseau there, we're complaint driven. So we rely on members of the public and now veterinarians who are obligated to report any concerns to us for complaints to come to us. With 7 officers, we could likely drive all over the province and not necessarily see things, so we rely on the public. There are provisions for routine inspections, so we can routinely inspect premises where there are animals for sale, hire, exhibition, slaughter, or provision of service for as it relates to the animal. So this allows us to then look at boarding kennels, boarding stables, grooming parlors, all of those places now. I would like to say that we're able to get routine inspections in, but currently right now, our focus is on the incoming new complaints and then following up on court orders and prohibitions to ensure that people that have abused and neglected animals and been sentenced are being held accountable and don't have animals in their possession. So we don't have a ton of time for routine inspections. So the complaint comes into our dispatcher. Dispatcher reviews it, ensures it's within our mandate. If it's not, it would be referred to another agency. So a stray animal or a bylaw related issue would be referred to another agency. It's within our mandate. There's a belief that there's an animal in distress because of lack of food and water, and there's no shelter. It's assigned to an officer and given a priority. The animal protection officer will maybe contact the complainant if they require any additional information, if the complainant's left their name, and we would make the initial attendance. Determining if this was a founded or unfounded complaint. If it's unfounded and we arrive and there's no concerns under the Animal Protection Act, we will leave the premises. We'll get back to the complainant, let them know that there were no concerns, and it could be an instance where they just weren't aware or they didn't see those things, just reassuring them that the animal is being cared for appropriately. Inconclusive there, people ask a number of times, well, what's inconclusive? Inconclusive is usually limited to, is usually when we are limited by our access to property and by that private dwellings. So we just can't barge into someone's house. We're a law enforcement agency. If the owner doesn't consent to let us in or bring the animal out to us to view or go inside to view the conditions, it would be inconclusive, and we would have to gain further information from either witnesses or people that have been inside the residence to obtain enough information to obtain a search warrant to enter into that private dwelling. So that's what inconclusive. If it is founded and there are concerns, we work with the owner to improve the situation. We want to have the owner relieve that animal of its distress. If the owner is not willing to relieve the animal of its distress, obviously the next is further interventions. Our goal is not to go out and seize everybody's animal. Our goal is to improve the lives of those animals and provide the owner with the tools and education that they need to improve those animals' lives. So we'll leave requirements. We have what is called a corrective action order, and that gives the owner a period of time into which to rectify those conditions. And should they not, they can be charged for not following that corrective action order as well if they failed to. At that point, after being given an opportunity, then we move to the next step, which is seizure if the owner has failed to relieve the animal of its distress. So we would take the animal into protective custody, and if necessary, if it warrants it, laying charges and prosecution when it is appropriate. Having said that, now on some of the things that you've seen the definition of what distress is, you've seen some of the things that we commonly come across that were pretty obvious ones of what is distress or being abuse and neglect. So what isn't illegal? So dogs being tethered 24/7 as long as they're provided an opportunity to exercise. Dogs not getting walked, although we would consider that being an opportunity to exercise. If a dog is confined to the backyard but is never taken for walks but has the ability to run around and exercise, it's not distress. Dogs barking, livestock in small pens. I'll make a caveat to that. As long as the pen size meets what is within the code of practice, keeping livestock in small enclosures is still acceptable. Livestock with feed but not pasture, as long as they're being provided either through feeding regularly and they're not on pasture, that is acceptable. They're being provided food sufficient to keep themselves in a state of good health. Cattle without shade. We've got many areas of the province where cattle are out on pasture, and with what is there, as long as they can get into hollows and natural areas is the way that it's described to get away from injurious heat, that is considered acceptable. Snow is a water source for sheep or cattle, pets not being vaccinated, horses without winter blankets, humanely euthanizing animals, not living on the same site with your animals, and then finally breeding dogs, cats, rabbits, or any other animals for profit are not illegal. So how do you as an individual know if it's distress? You don't have to. You just have to have a reasonable belief that something isn't right. That's the responsibility of an animal protection officer to do an investigation. If it doesn't seem normal, it might not be. So trust your instincts. If it doesn't look right or doesn't feel right to you, if in doubt, call. We'd rather have unfounded complaints than unreported emergencies and animals in distress. You just need to have, as I said, a reasonable belief that something is wrong and not being provided under the Animal Protection Act. So we talked a lot about the animal side of it. And so now these are not just animal problems. Animal welfare problems are caused by humans. And usually these humans have their own welfare challenges, whether it's mental health, addictions, poverty, finances, death in the family, depression, even involving elder, and I should put in there now that I've reviewing the slide, I should put older adult in there, I'll make a note of it, or child neglect. So I believe it was the presenter with the domestic violence that used it. Animal abuse and interpersonal violence often co-occur, and they were 100% correct. If people are at risk, animals are likely at risk, and vice versa. Animal protection officers can usually resolve the animal issue, but that doesn't solve the human problem or problems. So to combine this so that give you an understanding of the link. So the animal child abuse link often manifests in child sexual abuse. And the animals are abused to keep the child silent about the sexual incidents and warn the child that she or he could be next. So that is typically where we see animal abuse in those types of situations. A person who engages in animal sexual abuse are more likely to engage in child sexual abuse. Children who are violent against animals are most likely to have been sexually abused themselves. With domestic violence, animal abuse becomes a coercive control device to gain control or exert revenge over the human victim, and it becomes a pattern of indoctrination, which the abuser wears down the victim over years by exerting this power and control. And if you leave me, I'll hurt your cat. And we heard from the domestic violence, I think it was upwards of almost 7 to 12 times. I think they're saying now a person will attempt to leave before they actually do. Older adult context is more multifaceted and usually indicates a senior either on a fixed income or lack of adequate utilities or facilities to care for themselves, let alone the animals, or having too many animals, or is a victim of a family member's financial exploitation. All of these examples I'm giving are ones that we have encountered. Animal abuse is also linked to other crimes, including narcotics, animal fighting, property crimes, and I went back to my old agency and just asked if they had any recent statistics. And so with the detective I worked with the Calgary Police Service for the past 18 months, 93% of the offenders that had been charged with under the Animal Protection Act or the Criminal Code for animal abuse had also been investigated, charged, or convicted of some form of domestic violence. And 85% of those offenders were also involved in an average of 3 to 4 other criminal code offenses. So these are not just animal calls. Humans are involved, humans that have their own problems. So how do we deal with it? Well, reporting abuse and participating in investigations. Participating is the key in making real improvement in animal welfare. So how do you do that? Know what the legislation is, know what distress is so that you can identify it and then report it. If you're an agency or work within a professional organization, develop protocols for when and how to make a complaint. In particular, I always speak about the veterinary community who's exposed to it. And what's interesting is for domestic violence victims, the top 3 professions where people in domestic violence situations will open up and speak about the domestic violence is veterinarians, dental professionals, and hairdressers. So if you're in one of those professions and you're working in that within your group, develop protocols for when and how to make a complaint, whether they've disclosed that there's animal abuse or domestic violence, take those seriously and report them. And an investigation will determine if there's a problem or not. APOs will be able to solve this, will be able to enable solutions one way or another if there are any problems. And then finally, we have a lot of people that want to be anonymous. I appreciate that. However, especially in abuse cases where it's physical of an animal, with an officer not having any physical evidence of the animal being abused, good witness statements and the willingness to testify are key to holding these people accountable. So agree to give statements and to testify. So making a report. Who do you determine what the proper agency is? So in Saskatchewan, it's within the city limits of Saskatoon, it's the Saskatoon SPCA. Within Regina, it's the Regina Humane Society. And everywhere else in the province of Saskatchewan, it's Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan. So what do you need to make a report? Gather as much information as you can. The owner's name if it's known, but specifically the location. So an address, or if you don't know the address, the legal land description or driving directions, the type and number of animals that are involved. If it's a specific animal, the 2 Chihuahuas are fine, but the Rottweiler, the black and tan Rottweiler always seems to be getting kicked by the owner. And then specific details of the concern. On such and such a date, I saw this, or I see no shelter, those type of things, as much detail as possible. And so how can you report? So you can either call or use the online reporting form, and you can remain anonymous if you want to, but as I said, be willing to participate. Be the voice of these animals and be willing to speak up. And it is, like I said, helpful if you're willing to participate fully. And I went through that quite quickly, and Josh never appeared on camera, so obviously there's no questions.
No questions yet, but again, here's a reminder to everyone. If you do have any questions, we still have time to get to them, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to get your questions into Dawn. If the Q&A feature isn't working for you, feel free to pop your questions into chat as well. And of course, there's always the verbal option too, where we can set you up to speak with Dawn directly, as long as you have access to a microphone right now. Dawn, while we wait for some questions to come in, is there anything that you'd like to tell us a little bit about Animal Protection Services in addition to some of the information you shared? I know you guys recently started wearing new uniforms and you now have marked vehicles. Is that something that you might want to share a little bit with the folks here today?
Yes. So previously to, oh boy, that's just a couple of months back, animal protection officers within the province didn't have a uniform presence. They had badges and identification cards, which they were required to show. But now we have moved towards a uniform service just for easy identification and recognition for the public, as well as marked vehicles that identify them as being an animal protection officer with Animal Protection Services, so that they're easily identifiable and there's no confusion, again, like I said, with us being a rescue or other types of organization. Thanks for that, Josh. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And we do have a couple of questions coming in now. Dennis asked in the chat, Don, what type of perpetrators or situations are most likely to result in temporary or permanent animal ownership bans?
So for temporary ownership bans, and what I'm thinking Dennis is alluding to, temporary bans would be if a person is charged under the criminal code for under usually section 445 or 446 of the criminal code. And in that case, the RCMP or municipal police officer can place conditions on the person to be not to own, possess, or be in charge of the care of an animal until the court case has been settled. And so that's a temporary ban. Any permanent bans are ones where an individual has been convicted of an Animal Protection Act offense, and then the court has made an order for the banning of an animal for a period of time. What was the other portion of the question there, Josh? There was one other section of it.
Yeah, it was temporary or permanent ownership bans. What types of situations do perpetrators most likely result in temporary or permanent animal ownership bans?
Most of those are on what I would call the more severe end. This isn't just something that can be dealt with by way of education. These are ones where typically we've either had dead animals or significantly injured animals on the property that have required care, sort of elevates it. And then if there's a willfulness, we will then, with consultation with the Crown, recommend that they be charged criminally as well.
Okay. Another question that's come in, is a homeowner responsible for medical issues if they pertain to or allow feral cats to live on their property?
Ooh, that's a difficult question without asking more questions myself. So if is the owner providing, say, food or water to these animals where they would be considered the person in charge of care, or are these truly just feral cats that are passing through the property? We've had instances where groups or rescue groups have developed TNR programs where once you've trapped the cat, performed a procedure, you are now responsible for that animal. So if you release it without having someone taking care of that feral cat colony in that TNR, then yes, they could be held responsible. But just a person that's, I'm thinking of the rural resident that has some feral cats that have gone through their property, but they're not really owned or providing any care. I would say no.
Okay. Another question, Don, here is, are there any plans for, or do your APOs ever visit livestock slaughter facilities to verify animal care prior to and during slaughter?
So we've actually done several of those attendances to slaughter facilities, and we've made arrangements with the Ministry of Agriculture to actually get more of our officers trained to be able to identify what they're looking for when doing that.
Okay. Another question, have you noticed an increase in the number of cases of animal neglect or abuse during the pandemic?
So we've actually, the first 2 months here in Saskatchewan, when they declared the state of emergency, we saw a significant decrease in our calls. And then after that, it was business as normal. And in fact, we've seen an increase in the number of calls. I think it's a combination of, for those people that are working from home, they're seeing animals around their community more. And then in rural situations, it's becoming more obvious.
So would you say it's increased for both livestock animals and companion animals as well, or is more one
Yeah,
more one than the other?
it's actually both. They've increased, both have increased, but at the same rate for either. Like one hasn't taken more than the other. It's just been an increase of both.
That's certainly interesting. I know a lot of folks have been paying attention to adoptions of animals too throughout the pandemic, and I don't think we hear too much about the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess, when it comes to abuse and neglect. So that was an interesting question. Another one that come through is if an animal is currently in distress, i.e. extremely thin or injured, but the owner is providing what the animal needs, such as adequate food and water and vet care, can they still be charged under the Act?
So I'm going to make an assumption in what the question is, and I'm assuming is that what they're talking about is an animal is, thin or injured, but when we arrive, the animal's needs are being met. Well, if there's evidence to support that these needs weren't being met prior and it allowed the animal to be in distress for a period of time, then they can still be charged under the Act just because they fixed it now. And I use the example of our corrective action orders. we go in, livestock producers given a period of time to increase feed and everything else and body condition, but they let their animals get to a body condition score of 1 out of 5. And there was a number of dead animals on the property. Just because they fixed it now doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable for what was previously there. So the short answer would be yes, they most certainly can be.
Don, maybe you can speak a little bit about this too. I know in some cases where a person may make a complaint because they believe an animal is being neglected, but they're also in a situation where they're trying to help the animal and they're going and providing food and water. So when an APO comes out to investigate, there is the appearance that the animal does have, the food and water. What would your organization do in a situation like that? I'm assuming there would be a more in-depth investigation that takes place.
Yeah, and in fact, it's funny they should ask that question. I was just listening to our operations assistant communicate with a person who had made a complaint, and they indicated to us that they were providing the food and water so that when our officer goes out, even though there's food and water there, it's not the owner that's doing it. It's hard for people to hear, but we directed them to stop doing that, and that we would go out and investigate further to ensure that this owner was the one providing what is necessary for the animal.
So that's one of those situations where they're trying to be helpful, but in the long run, it's maybe not the most helpful thing they can be doing.
No, exactly.
Another question here. Can a person not be charged when they move and leave their animals behind?
So in the very bottom section of distress was abandoned. And if a person abandons their animal, so that can mean, they move and leave if the animal is left behind after the tenancy agreement expires, if the animal is left at a place for service, say a vet clinic or a boarding kennel, and it's been 4 days, that's also considered abandonment. Or if they've been incarcerated and haven't made arrangements for the animal, that's also considered abandonment, and they most certainly can be charged under the Animal Protection Act.
And another question, in your experience in Saskatchewan, how often are you seeing individuals charged and convicted under APA or Animal Protection Act or Criminal Code charges?
So this is a two-part answer. So I can only speak for our agency, and of our call volume, typically we're seeing about 3 to 4% of our call volume result in charges being laid under the Animal Protection Act and the Criminal Code, or the Criminal Code. And if you're looking at that's charged, convicted, what's quite interesting to me is that we've got about a 99% conviction rate.
That's impressive.
It's quite high.
Yeah. Can animal protection officers in Saskatchewan lay charges themselves under both the Criminal Code and the Animal Protection Act, or do you guys need to work with the Crown and other police services to do that?
So we don't have criminal code authority, so we have to work with the RCMP or municipal police forces to provide our file to them. We can lay charges under the Animal Protection Act, but not the criminal code. We can also refer the case to the Crown, who will then recommend criminal code charges be laid, and then they will pass it to the police service of jurisdiction for them to lay the appropriate charge.
Okay. And something that folks might not be aware of, that maybe you could speak a little bit to, Don, is I believe that Animal Protection Services, on your website, there is a conviction section where folks can go and see convictions that have been issued or laid down.
They can see the individuals that have been convicted, as well as their sentences, and they will have, if they have prohibitions, it'll have the time frame in which they're prohibited. So if anybody runs into these folks that have animals and they see that they're on the prohibition list, make sure you give us a call, because they shouldn't have animals.
Good to know. We got a couple more questions here. I know we're drawing close to the end of our time. The one question here is, can you comment on the challenges involved in an animal hoarding situation?
Most definitely, because it requires a multiple agency response. A number of times we can fix the animal problem, but it's more difficult to deal with the human problem. Typically, hoarding, mental health related issue, usually bylaw issues towards nuisance properties, a public health issue with regard to the hoarding, because it may not just be animals. Usually there's possessions involved with a significant amount of clutter. So engaging public health, the fire department, mental health services, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, and getting all of those agencies on board to work together. It's worked successfully in a number of cases, and we're still working with those agencies closely in what is referred to as the Interagency Human and Animal Welfare Task Team at sort of the deputy minister level for all these ministries to be able to communicate and work together through the different bits of legislation.
That definitely is a difficult challenge, I think, for many organizations in that type of situation. And another question, what percentage of complaints are unfounded, i.e. the animals are found to be cared for properly?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I guess it would have to, it sometimes varies from year to year, but typically, and I'm just actually going back into our report so that I can give them accurate numbers. So for last year, sorry, I had the wrong date in there. So there we go. So the number of percentage of unfounded was just at 35%.
And is that average throughout every year, or?
That seems to be typical. It kind of fluctuates between 32 and the highest I've seen is 45.
But pretty standard there. Last question, I think here, Don, we have, is there any plan to change the criteria, or at least the language on what distress means, to include affective states? It's weird to see how, based on the code of practice, a cattle is in distress if it is castrated at 6 months of age, but it is not if it is castrated with 5 months and 29 days of age.
That would be a Ministry of Agriculture question for change in legislation. I know that there are a number of advocacy groups that are looking to change, but I would suspect with it being a new piece of legislation in 2018, I would find it unlikely that the ministry would look to changing the definition in the act, like reopening an act. They may look at amendment somehow in the regulations to the code of practice as it pertains to livestock, but changing the distress definition, I would think would be unlikely, but I'd point them in the direction of the Ministry of Agriculture for that discussion.
Great, thanks, Don. And I think that will bring to a close the webinar for today. There's a couple of notes that I'd like to pass along before we say farewell to everyone. If you're interested in learning more about the Saskatchewan SPCA and some webinars that we have coming up, we encourage you to sign up for our webinars by visiting our website at saskspca.ca/webinar signup. You can see Crystal, my colleague from the Sask SPCA, just popped the link into into the chat for you. There is also a webinar coming up on June 8th, and we invite you to join us for that. It is part of the Working to End Violence speaker series, and it features Crystal Giesbrecht, who is from the Provincial Association of Transition Houses and Services of Saskatchewan. Crystal's presentation will focus on intimate partner violence and animal ownership and the experiences of survivors and service providers. It will also be a Zoom webinar, much like this, and it is taking place on June 8th at 2 p.m., and you can register by visiting violencelink.ca/WTEV. And on that note, Don, do you have any closing remarks for the folks in attendance today?
No, I thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate everybody attending today and listening to me speak. If you have any questions, hopefully you got my contact information. If you want to send me an email, I'd be more than happy to answer any more questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Don, and thanks to everybody for attending. This has been a great series, and if you have joined us for more than one, thank you so much for your support, and we certainly hope that you will join us for future webinars as well. Thanks again, everybody. Take care and stay safe.